In Vampire the Masquerade, there are many figures powerful enough to merit the status of god. The first vampire, Cain, was himself revered as a god by both kindred and kine alike. Yet much of his tale is lost within the sands of time, and many vampires even consider the Dark Father a mere myth, especially in the most present of nights. The Antediluvians, the dreaded third generation, are also considered to be godly beings. The progenitors of the 13 clans, they too were gifted with immense strength to topple empires and birth great dark lineages, which would span for millennia, though they have also become elusive boogeymen, the type you tell stories of to keep the young Cainites awake when the night comes to a close. Mithras, however, is a name many can recall, and depending on who you ask, can instill great admiration or deathly fear. It is rare to find a vampire who shaped not only the ancient world, but the modern one as well. But Mithras is that exception. A vampire so notorious, so mythical in his exploits, a whole cult formed around him, surviving through thousands of years of historical evolution, with its members still prowling the urban wastes in modern nights. A powerful vampire may control a street, or perhaps a city if they're lucky. Mithras owned an entire country, and his aura of supreme rule can be felt across the British Isles even to this night. Revered as a god of war, much of Mithras' acclaim was won through victory on the battlefield. He built a reputation for not only outsmarting his opponent, but annihilating them. He often spared no quarter, leaving entire forces bloodied and without mercy, though the one soul he spared would end up changing his existence forever. The tale of Mithras is one which spans many ages, and many key events in both world and vampiric history. So tonight, we'll be detailing his ascent to becoming the Prince of Avalon, from his time spent with the Roman army conquering the western frontiers, to manipulating the vampiric powers of Britain, to falling under his ultimate command. We will also delve into the mysteries surrounding Mithras in the present, and how he still dominates Great Britain to this very night. But first, if you like grim tales from dark universes, or want to learn more about the world of darkness, perhaps leave a like or even subscribe, as it helps the channel immensely. Methuselah, or otherwise Childer of Antediluvians, are considered some of the most powerful vampires within the world of darkness. It is said that Mithras was indeed the spawn of the dreaded third generation, though much of this can be chalked up to speculation. The story goes that Mithras' descent into vampirism occurred within the ancient world, around 1258 BC, in the area of what is now Iran and was ancient Persia. In his mortal life, Mithras was a decorated soldier and a prominent military leader. Soldiering was Mithras' entire being. He loved nothing more than to be surrounded by his army, executing his masterful tactics and achieving victory against his liege's chosen enemy. It has been said that he had always enjoyed these games of strategy from a young age, and rarely ever lost. The final battle of Mithras' mortal existence would be quelling a rebellion, but he was instructed to not just bring it to order, but to take every head of every leader which fueled the flames of this insurrection. To a distinguished soldier such as Mithras, this appeared to be an easy task. Yet the rebels were being aided by powers of which the mortal mind could scarcely comprehend. Magic emboldened these warriors, and within their mountain fortifications, they posed a lethal threat to this Persian king's rule. Undeterred, Mithras marched his army to the rebel fortifications, passing through the mountains to enact the king's devastation upon the enemy. However, the battles that came would not be easily won. It took many grueling days and many of his own men to finally relieve the rebel generals of their heads, all but one. Safe in believing the rebellion was crushed, Mithras returned to his camp, preparing his men to return back to their king with the remnants of the rebel foes displayed for his satisfaction. However, a peaceful night's slumber was not on the cards for our general. With the moon high in the sky and silence cascading across the arid mountain pass, a figure trespassed into Mithras's tent. Initially, the general tried to shout for his guards to apprehend the man immediately, yet as he tried to muster his voice, he found it cut short. Fear swallowed his soul in moments, as this deathly visage slowly unveiled its identity. The stranger was indeed the final rebel leader, who had eluded Mithras's capture, but instead of surrendering himself to this mighty general or enacting some dark and depraved revenge, he was intrigued by Mithras. Impressed even, he decided to make him an offer. The being spoke in a manner unlike any he had witnessed, a being who revered itself above those around it. He looked upon the fallen corpses as inferior tools, used and discarded to service a greater cause. But for Mithras, he could ensure something of which many powerful people crave and desire: the key to immortality. On top of this, he said Mithras could lead an army, magnitudes greater than the one he had at present. All of this could be his, but if he refused, he could eradicate the very name of Mithras in a second, ending his life and legacy forever. Even a mortal unaware of the true power of an antediluvian would find it impossible to refuse such a request. And caught within its fearsome aura, Mithras accepted. And from that moment, the mortal man's life ended, and his new existence as a Cainite began. For 2 years he spent learning about this so-called unlife, adopting new powers and honing his strength. He soon mingled with others like himself. Now a Ventru Methuselah, an immensely powerful vampire of the clan of kings, Mithras found it fitting to no longer serve within the shadow of another ruler. He would become the new liege, or better yet, the new god. With his newfound companions, Mithras traveled under the cover of night to the kingdom he once served. For Mithras, it was a simple task to convert the people of this land to service a new god. For seeing is truly believing, and the once mortal man was now something far more. He heralded himself as the sun god, the man that chased the light across the sky and emerged within the dark hours of the night. Soon, the temples of the old gods were demolished, giving space for new monuments in Mithras's almighty honor. Offerings were made before him, and Mithras was quick to cement himself as the new deity within this region. Yet as the years passed, the changing tides of world politics shifted ever westward. Traveling west with his companions, Mithras soon became intrigued by a growing force on the Mediterranean. To Mithras, these were mere barbarians, but they had shown that as a united front, they could ravage any established settlement or nation through their sheer passion for war. Mithras saw this himself firsthand, as he accompanied his companions to a city nearer the influence of these people. As the city they resided within grew into a great empire, so too did the barbarians' exploits multiply and advance. Their armor, weapons, logistics, and leadership were unparalleled. It seemed that any foe which stood in their path would surely fall before their spears. And as this army conquered this dwindling empire Mithras stood within, the barbarian horde seduced him further, to the point that he left his companions in secret and went to survey this growing tribe. Mithras knew the importance of his own immortality, perhaps better than most vampires across the span of kindred existence, and he utilized this aspect to influence the minds of mortals he wished to control. These Romans were no exception to this fact. It did not take long at all for Mithras to become the new god of their vastly expanding armies. Heralding himself as the god of war, the soldier's god, he soon found favor amongst the ranks of the many warriors within the Imperium Romanum. For Mithras, it was a simple fact that gaining the unwavering support of the army grants the keys to the kingdom, and thus as the Roman army's chosen deity, with his portrait hung within every encampment, he soon became one of the greatest contenders for Cainite rule within this immensely important empire. However, Mithras was not alone in his vampiric interests within Rome. In fact, the empire had attracted the masses of the undead, promising great cities of bountiful feeding stocks, more bloody politics, and the potential to lead the flocks of mortals to create a haven for vampires, so they could live out their immortality as omnipotent rulers. This did not come without its plethora of caveats. For all the gifts vampirism grants to a mortal, it comes with its equal amount of drawbacks. Such is true with vampiric society as well. The Elders of the Eternal Senate, vampires that would unintentionally inspire Cainite politics for millennia, created a system which both offered a space for those of the undead to negotiate their existence, and also drove a wedge between those of what would become to be known as high clans and those of the low clans. The Eternal Senate, created by Prince Collat within the 4th century BC, primarily favoured his own rule over anything else. Second to himself came his clan, the Ventrue, and any kindred that wished to become a Cainite senator had to be voted in. Only senators could vote, and those lucky senators who hailed from Clan Ventrue had their votes count as thrice. You can only imagine that the outcome of such a policy led to a political class dominated by the Clan of Kings, which constantly protected the interests of Collat himself. It was, to Mithras, obviously inefficient. The bloat of elders constantly squabbling over their own trivial matters would certainly be their own eventual downfall, but a god could hardly trouble himself with that eventuality. Mithras pursued what he knew best, persuading the minds of mortal soldiers to fight in his name. He dedicated much of his time to accompanying the Roman legions on their conquests across Europe. By this time, Mithras needn't even step foot in a country to have his presence felt across every inch of land trampled by the Roman Empire. Temples which honored him as their deity were scattered wherever soldiers fortified or spilled blood. The fact that Mithras was a Cainite to most of his loyal mortal worshippers was irrelevant. To them, he was simply a god, a being which withstood the erosion of time and emboldened the legions of Rome to march forever onward to their next foe. In Britain, before Mithras became enamored by the cold and unforgiving island, was a temple honoring him in almost every city. As the cult of Mithras grew, he found himself ever more driven to this troubled isle, and in 71 AD, he met with his worshippers in Britain. The first battles he saw were with the legions who marched north to battle Venusius of the Celtic Brigantes tribe. Seeing firsthand the bloody and ferocious combat prowess of the inhabitants of this land, he compelled the legions to war on. With the inspiration of their deity close by, much blood was spilled for the delight and indulgence of an ancient vampire who knew very well his appetite, and how ravenous it was becoming. Great legends of Mithras tell of his involvement with the legions taking on the mighty Garu, who thrived in the many woodlands where the Celts and Picts dwelled. All across what is now Scotland, Mithras kept the legions safe from these nightmarish beasts of the night, having slain over 100 werewolves by his hand alone. It was at this time that Mithras knew this was a land untamed. A tenth of the Roman military was stationed within Britain, yet even with their numbers, every victory was constantly met with resistance. One step forward for the Roman Empire often led to 2 to 3 steps back, facing onslaughts and raids from swathes of emboldened barbarians baying for imperial blood. Every day and every night was chaos unbridled, and Mithras reveled in it. It was at this point where he began to assert his own Cainite dominance over the land. Every night he strategized his takeover, marking out every elder vampire who resided in the country. Many were intertwined with the Celtic tribes, and were for the most part beyond the reach of Mithras. But this was not so much of an issue. His primary targets were the gluttonous vampires who clung like parasites to the empire, empire. The purge was swift, and night after night, the vampiric political figureheads of Britain met their final deaths. In the wake of all this bloodshed, more feeble Cainites took their place, ripe for manipulation. Mithras allowed these petty rulers to occupy cities within the country, building their own meager domains, but under one condition: they must give tribute to Mithras through money and blood. Once he had set up his domain in Londinium, his court, hosted at the temple near the river Walbrook, would become the scene of great offerings to himself. Vampire leaders would bend the knee to him and offer all they could to swear their undying fealty to the god. Some upstarts within the vampiric society of Britain resisted, but they should have heeded the example set by their forebears. Mithras was able to snuff them out with ease, and further punishment for any disobedience against his omnipotent rule was met with merciless violence. It could be said that at this time, Mithras was the strongest vampire known to the world of darkness. However, this simple fact did not come without its challenges. The turbulent state of Celtic Britain was rife with upstarts and shadowy figures, with many elders still pulling the strings from the lands occupied fiercely by the local inhabitants. This was particularly troublesome for Mithras whenever he needed to protect his interests in Scotland and Wales. Irish raiders also joined their Celtic brethren to stoke the flames of war within the Isles. But Rome's solution was not one of swift action, for Rome was not built in a day, and neither would Britain bend the knee to the empire in a few years. It would take a century for the nation to be quelled, and for Rome to supplant the power structures of the Celts and to become the true ruling force in the land. As Rome fortified Britain, Mithraims would begin to sprout all over the nation, honoring the mighty sun god who aided the imperial troops in their times of bloodshed. Soon, even the Celts would be giving offerings to Rome and Mithras. But as 2 centuries passed, the state of Britain began to change drastically once more. It would not be long until the now Romanized Britain came under attack from new invaders. Saxons began to attack the sea fortifications on the eastern coast, and some even found success in their violent conquests. This of course brought a whole host of new kindred, with Britain's shores now hosting La Sombra, Malkavian, Toreador, and more than true. These younger kindred came from all over Europe, many from Rome itself, having heard of the ripe opportunities within the new nation. These dreams of fortune and bountiful feeding were met with fierce competition. These newer Cainites constantly fought with the older circles of vampires already established within Britain's cities, all fighting over every drop of legionary blood. Small conflicts arose in these now thriving settlements. Mithras was not concerned with these battles between whelps. The sun god had no loyalty to his elder kin, neither did he have pity for the neonates who wished to grow into their vampirism. All he cared for was his status within Britain, and maintaining it for millennia to come. He did keep an eye on who came out of these conflicts victorious, however, as it was always useful to separate the strong from the weak, especially to groom them for greater positions within his established court. Some, which were deemed perhaps worryingly powerful, were invited to London, and their tales were cut drastically short. Rome was an issue which was out of Mithras's hands. Even if he wished to maintain his powerful political structures within Roman Britain, the slow erosion of the empire would inevitably force his hand. As the imperial front line within Germania waned, and more legionary bodies were strewn across the battlefields of Europe, vampires across the empire took this as a sign to flee to areas where they would not meet a similar fate. Britain, despite its turbulent growth, was a land perfect for many Cainites to seek refuge. Whilst at first this was a small uptick in the vampiric population, this soon swelled into numbers which were deemed uncontrollable. Vampires do not make the best neighbours, and with many battling over turf to secure feeding stocks for their survival, this would only lead to uncontrollable conflict, and would only worsen as their population grew. Mithras, surveying this societal change, grew impatient with these conflicts. The more it encroached on his interests, the more drastic he came with his solutions. Thus, he decreed that a purge would be conducted in Britain for the vampiric population. Any that were not loyal to Mithras would either meet their final death by the claws of their own kin, or finally see the sunrise, blessing their skin, flesh and bones with the holy kiss of radiant fire. The sun god took special measures to target the La Sombra population, more so than other clans venturing to the island. This can be chalked up to an ancient grudge, with the Ventru and the La Sombra often at each other's throats, even to the present night. Whilst these cullings of the undead were taking place, Mithras took special care to reorganize his kingdom of the night. He would appoint new advisors, enforcers, and would bolster his inner circle, carefully selecting the surviving Cainites from these massacres, and allowing them to choose who they wished to lead them in their own fiefdoms. These fiefs, unlike centuries prior, were bound to Mithras. They would be appointed advisors known as satraps, which could occupy any level of power within this settlement. These satraps were some of the first vampires to claim the role of sheriff, while some claimed their own princedoms and gave tribute to Mithras. Some even took to the shadows, acting as the sun god's eyes and ears outside of London. Any whiff of disloyalty in these domains, and you could be sure that it would be met with fangs and claws, ready to send any disloyal lick to an ashy end. This totalitarian rule of Britain soon reached Europe through rumours and gossip. Many who had planned to flee across the Channel cancelled their expeditions, choosing to seek other refuge rather than to bend the knee to some so-called vampire god. Despite his reputation souring across the West, Mithras still held a considerable amount of political clout. In 121 AD, a meeting was held between himself and an extremely powerful being, of which even in those ancient times was still considered something of a myth. A band of Saracens sailed to the British Isles, accompanying a guest of great importance, set to meet this god of war in his own domain. This guest was far more aged than Mithras, his vampiric generation marking him as an antediluvian. They would discuss philosophy, politics, and history from one god to another. Hakim, the father of the clan Banu Hakim, on that night had begun a history which would embolden the Prince of Avalon to be, and would ultimately become his undoing. Hakim left the Walbrook Mithraeum with his band of robed Saracens, with Mithras once again the talk of vampiric society, leading to this event becoming somewhat of a legendary occurrence within the history of Cainites. However, as the centuries dwindled by, Mithras began to feel the effects of his ancient existence taking their toll on his body. Christianity was sweeping Britain, with the Roman populations throwing out their pagan idols and adopting the Trinity as their chosen worship. As peace spread across the nation, the Romanized populace took more to leisurely activities, baths and parties, instead of soldiering. By 410, the legions were all sent to reinforce the German frontier, and Roman Britain was beginning to realize that its place within the empire was becoming more fragile than ever. It would not be long until the Celtic inhabitants began to see the cracks in the Roman civilization, and a great alliance was formed. Irish pirates, Pictish warriors, and Saxons allied to mount a great attack on the cities of Roman Britain. Hadrian's wall crumbled under the relentless force, and whilst the settled British forces attempted to defend their territories, without the support of the legions, they lost battle after battle. The coast was pillaged, cities fell to these hordes, and Mithras was suffering ever more from his calling. Vampires across the Isles begged for Mithras to intervene, but after years of onslaught, he had vanished. The sleep of the ancients had beckoned him, and he had reluctantly answered the call. In the time where Mithras slept, the empire fell. Saxons and Celts warred between each other. Vortigern took power and fell to his Saxon mercenaries. Legend tells of a man named Arturos, or Arthur, who led an age of peace, yet many Cainites surmise this was a mere fabrication, conceived within the grim nights which followed. Angles, Saxons, and Jutes invaded, held power for some time until being ransacked by the Vikings, all of which in turn were crushed by William the Conqueror, the first of many Norman kings. All the while Mithras slept, his vampiric societies diminished. Feeding was poor, and political turmoil was rife in the vast power vacuum left by his godly presence. Respect of elders became less enforced, as petty princes were usurped by younger kindred, constantly seeking to manipulate the anarchy of this land for their own gain. If you weren't a survivalist at heart during these times, chances are you would not see many knights. Assassinations became an epidemic, and the silence of blood, an ancient tradition which masked vampiric actions from mortal eyes, was consistently ignored. In 1066, amidst the chaos and turmoil of a newly conquered Britain, many vampires began to see once again the ripe opportunities this land offered. With many of the vampiric rulers diminished by the instability of Norman Britain, newer, more continental forces could easily usurp their power structures. Or so some thought. The Triumvirate, not to be confused with the Triumvirate of Constantinople, were a group of Ventru Cainites who saw such an opportunity. Accompanying the Norman invaders, they sought to initially enter the lands as diplomats. These power-crazed vampires were brazen enough to believe that they could simply offer great opportunities to vampiric feudal lords within Europe, especially at the French courts. The native lords despised the Triumvirate, and the more they did not cooperate with their supposedly enticing demands, the more these Ventru directed the Norman rulers to oppress the native populations of Britain. It soon became very apparent that these vampires were both highly talented and completely merciless. Occupying for a brief time the power vacuum Mithras had left, they set about hiring mercenaries to guard domains they believed were preferable to their appetites, whilst also conducting ruthless attacks on those who got in the way of their schemes. Many vampires soon began to appease the Triumvirate, seeking the meager stability they offered in an otherwise cruel and vicious country. However, the true nature of these Ventru soon began to become clear, as the Normans pushed further into the Isles, and began to venture into Wales and Scotland. Soon, vampiric domains were set ablaze, as these Cainites subtly pushed the Norman forces to harry populations they regarded as a threat. Native vampires were the prime target of these attacks, and soon a trail of burned-out havens followed their wake. When war finally came out of the ashes of these attacks, it is said when the first drops of blood was spilled upon the battlefield, Mithras awoke in 1069. Mithras, now roaming the lands of his former kingdom, soon began to cause a great stir across the nation. Mithras did not return to his court in London until 1085, but the city had changed vastly from when he was once its sole ruler. The vampiric lords were hostile towards his presence, and upon hearing of his awakening, swiftly burned the remaining Mithraeum within the city. Effectively chased out of a domain he once called his own, Mithras was forced into temporary exile, which gave him ample time to scheme and orchestrate his rise back to the seat of power. Being a profound tactician, he knew that within his current stance, he could not strong-arm the multitudes of vampiric factions which now existed amidst the chaos of the Triumvirate's making. Thus, Mithras went straight to the individual members of this trio, to conspire and subtly direct them to aspiring to loftier goals. This inevitably caused the three to begin distrusting each other, and with each plot formulated, another of the group would spit accusations of betrayal. The Triumvirate became so unstable that Mithras's scheming caused an overspill into several petty civil wars, causing many leaders present within Norman Britain to be overthrown and more younger kindred to take their place. These events mirrored the mortal ones at the time, most notably the anarchy between 1135 and 1153. Mithras made exact movements to divert the course of these petty conflicts to topple his rivals who had shunned him from his deserved seat of power. It is unclear how the Triumvirate met their end, but it was an awful coincidence that they did so in sometimes very bizarre, yet cryptically organized ways. The first was put to the sword by mortal soldiers. Another was ripped limb from limb by a pack of lupines, mysteriously in an area where werewolves did not usually linger. The last met their fate by the claws of Baroness Seren, and so did the reign of the Triumvirate conclude. By 1154, with all of his competitors eradicated, the god of war once again returned to London. It had been decades since his expulsion, centuries since he had last ruled over these isles, but as he returned, he ensured that he would reclaim it all. Thus, the remaining vampiric barons acknowledged Mithras as Prince of London and their feudal lord, the ruler of the Court of Avalon. The fiefs of the Court of Avalon are split between 16 cities, all with their own baron, which services as a prince of their own domain, albeit eventually blood bonded to Mithras and sworn to uphold his ideals. These are primarily located within England, but Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales all contain fiefs, acting as satellite states for Mithras to exert his control. Mithras' main concern was dominance over Britain, as he had maintained back when Rome ruled the lands. But in this constantly changing world of differing mortal factions swaying politics of vampire society, his ideals caused some turbulence. When the War of Princes waged across Europe, corresponding with the rise of mortal conflict within the area, such as the fall of Constantinople and the Fourth Crusade, Mithras was well aware that many Cainites on the continent wished he would send support to his satellite domains in Normandy, as Angevin and Plantagenet warred against each other. Mithras, however, declined, and thus many within his territories who supported his subjects within France turned coat and sailed across the Channel. However, this would all be pitiful in comparison to the events which would lead to the signing of the Rose Treaty, the vampiric Magna Carta. In 1215, Melusine de Anjou, Toreador and soon-to-be Queen of Winchester, managed to conjure up support from a number of Cainites across Britain. This primarily came in the displays of hot-headed violence across the Isles, leading to a short period of major instability under the Prince of Avalon's rule. To negate this, Melusine invited Mithras to sign a document, which signed away his right to raise an army, bar a small detail of bodyguards to protect him at any given time. This would in turn provide the barons with much more power to enact a greater level of authority over their fiefs, and to quash any rebellion which occurred. Whilst Mithras, in the short term, was diminished by this treaty, he soon saw to it that every baron would become bloodbound to him, whilst taking an oath to protect London if ever the prince saw it fit. The signing of this treaty was not recognised by every kindred in Britain. Notably, the Tremere did not sign. But the Prince of Avalon was already on a rocky course with the traitorous mages. Some have said that the treaty itself was redundant, for why would Mithras need an army, when he was considered by most an army unto himself? This was not the only test Mithras experienced during his time. For only 3 years prior to this, he was confronted by a being that would challenge not only his rule, but his status as a god amongst supernaturals. In 1212, neonates began to disappear from the streets of London, and sires began to petition Mithras to investigate. As this was all happening with the backdrop of the War of Princes raging in the background, he initially disregarded these occurrences. Casualties at this time were bound to take place, and kindred aligning themselves with warring factions was certainly in the firing line for a swift final death. However, as more and more neonates began to vanish, the situation became more of a pressing matter for the Prince of Avalon. Athelwulf, 7th generation gangrel and warlord to Mithras, was sent to decipher this string of disappearances. What he could gather was that these events took place within the daylight hours, impossible for a vampire to operate within. Someone or something had been seeking out the havens of young vampires and had wrenched them from their dwelling, throwing them out to be scorched and turned into a smouldering pile of ash by the sun. Athelwulf's many agents also managed to locate the perpetrator, but those that approached him met a grisly fate. He was a hulking man, reportedly with dark features and only one eye. Athelwulf himself would embark upon a personal mission to destroy this creature himself. He planned to enter the lodgings of this man at night and would supposedly turn the tables, surprising and dispatching him swiftly. The gangrel was able to execute the first part of the plan, yet upon encountering this behemoth, he found he was no match. This beast was simply stronger in every manner, his overwhelming power being akin to a god. With his tail between his legs, the gangrel warlord fled, making his way back to his master. But what Athelwulf had not anticipated was that this man was following him, all the way back to Mithras. Upon setting eyes upon the creature before him, Mithras suddenly had a wave of memories come through his mind, by just inspecting his image alone. He had heard tales of this man, a supposed dark avenger, and that his presence in his domain spelt no room for peace or negotiation. This man wanted vengeance, and vengeance through death. The creature was known as Horus the Undying, arch-nemesis of the antediluvian Set, and a god within his own right. To you and I, he would be considered a mummy, a creature conceived by the powers of mythical deities. He equaled, if not exceeded, the strength of Mithras, and earned his reputation through his vast and violent exploits across the ancient world and the new. There was no time for cutting words. Battle commenced in the short moments they had to recognize each other. Blows were traded as they battled across Mithras's haven, with the Prince of Avalon's strength being consistently outmatched by Horus's unimaginable speed. This was a true match for the vampire god, and their battle soon exploded out from the confines of the haven, destroying multiple buildings and causing a vast inferno to demolish entire parts of the city. Their duel stretched to the Tower of London and onto the banks of the Thames. Each strike dealt to either opponent could kill any lesser supernatural, but these two warring gods were to make their history on that night. As the sun began to threaten its appearance, the two were beaten and wounded in equal measure. They had both met their match that night, and vowed to each other that this duel was not yet over. However, with both parties requiring rest and shelter, they exited their battlefield. Horus would leave London in the months that came, seeking to make war with the Setites, the spawn of his nemesis. Mithras that night had showcased that he was not just a god in word alone, but in action also. He was not to be messed with, and since he gained the reputation as an indomitable force, and one to never be opposed. Despite his accolades won that night, Mithras was still bloodied and horrifically wounded. As he entered his haven once more, news spread of his injuries and weakened state. You may know this well by now, but vampires are quick to pounce on any given opportunity, and as the Prince of Avalon healed his grievous wounds, the barons conspired to overthrow him. His answer to this, in his weakened state, was to open up the council to receive more barons as his advisors. Mithras, throughout all eras of his reign, had retained a great number of advisory councils, but this one was orchestrated to simply appease the power-hungry barons and their appetites for higher offices. The Privy Council allowed barons to move from the secondary Great Council and heightened them to a position which provided easier access to speak with the prince. This in turn gave Mithras the unlimited capacity to influence the mass of vampiric leaders within the land, and to ensure that he would never be overruled again so long as he reigned. This council would also uphold the blood laws within England and Britain. These laws, based upon the traditions passed down by the Dark Father Cain, became subtly entwined with the common law of mortal England. Minor infractions which concern domain or hospitality were often punished with fines, most typically an offering of blood to the baron who demanded it. More serious infractions which broke traditions of progeny, accounting, destruction, or the silence, which would become later known as the Masquerade, were dealt either via banishment for minor offences or the blood hunt for those crimes which required outright destruction of the accused. These blood laws, of which Mithras upheld with his council, would only become altered when the Camarilla rose out of the fires of the Anarch Revolt, and it would be under the surveillance of Mithras when this now prominent sect came into creation. Mithras initially did not agree with other elders such as Hardestat, who in the wake of the revolt argued that a masquerade must be put in place to hide those that were most at risk from the flames of the vampire anarchs and those from the mortal inquisition. As a true soldier in his unbeating heart, Mithras could not just hide in the shadows. He was a god, not some meager peasant. With the advice of his seneschal Camden of the Cappadocian clan and advisors from his own kin and the Toreador, he begrudgingly accepted some of the more foundational beliefs of the sect. The blood laws were thus streamlined to fit into the Camarilla's traditions, but Mithras never fully aligned with this group. He had more troubling matters to attend to. Whilst he allowed the Convention of Thorns to be hosted within his domain, revolts and insurrections constantly came for his throat. The vampires of Britain used many events across history to make a name for themselves, and there was no better way to do so than to kill Mithras. What many fail to remember, however, is that Mithras is a god of war, and such a god does not go down without a bloody, ruthless fight. During the Wars of the Roses, his warlord Athelwulf was slain by the Baron of Lancaster. In response, Mithras dealt with him personally, driving a stake through his dead heart, and letting his defeat be a reminder to never trespass against him or anyone loyal to his cause. Throughout the years, he fended off opponent after opponent, maintaining his station as Prince of Avalon for centuries. As the years passed, Mithras ruled as mightily as he had during those ancient times. Through civil wars and the rise of the industrial era, he still remained the dark heart of Britain, for better or for worse. What would be the start of the end of the Prince of Avalon would be something of which would seem rather anticlimactic in the history of this god's unlife. In 1941, during the Blitz of World War II, incendiary bombs were dropped over Mithras's haven, causing a great fire which forced the Methuselah into torpor. His supporters swiftly ferried his body to a set of foundations of what would become the Centerpoint office, and there he remained, sealed off to the world and left for everyone else to believe that he was finally dead. Yet, in 1991, the sleeping god would wake once more, with his eyes opening to a modern Britain. Immediately, werewolves sensed that something dreadful had risen, sensing the essence of the worm deep within London. Entire packs of Fianna and bone gnawers quickly encroached on this makeshift tomb, and due to sensing the worm so strongly, they finally found him and his retinue of guards. In a rare show, Mithras attempted to parley with the Garou, but these battle-hardened werewolves were not going to listen to an entity so tainted by the worm. The battle was so fierce, it overflowed in a torrent of malignant claws and weapons. Spilling out onto Oxford Street, Mithras and the werewolves fought, their battle being won almost told from the ancient books of Supernatural's past. When all was said and done, Mithras stood there, bloodied and gored from the torrents of werewolf attacks. His guards were gutted and mutilated, resembling less of a human, more of piles of meat and bone. The werewolves, though tenacious in their battle, accompanied them, lay dead on that bloodied street. The only one left standing was Mithras, god of war, a soldier to the very end. Brought to his knees by the aggravated wounds stretching across his body, he found himself on the very brink of torpor. Perhaps the last thing Mithras ever saw out of his original eyes was the vision of a man that resembled someone he knew many centuries ago, a son of Hakim, a man by the name of Montgomery Coven. Monty, after seeing this battlefield of vampires, mortals, and werewolves strewn across the street in violent display, could only feel the palpable amount of power radiating from Mithras's body. He was a young Canaanite at the time, and highly susceptible to the temptations offered by this sight before him. His carnal instincts pushed him to do the unthinkable, and it was easy to give in to the beast inside of him. Plunging his fangs into the Prince of Avalon, he diablerized the vampire god, stealing his life, power, and soul. The tale of Monty Coven is a complex one, and one which diverts depending on which edition you choose to follow. Within V5, Monty was part of a Sabbat pack, which was led by Alcoan, a member of the Harbinger of Skulls. 50 years prior, the Ventru Valerius, former sheriff and later seneschal of London, conspired to put Mithras to the final death, believing London can only be free with his destruction. Luring him to the Admiralty gunpowder mills, using Roger de Camden as bait, Valerius detonated the mills with both Mithras and Camden inside. Reporting to Queen Anne Bowersley that Mithras had been destroyed, she soon took the title of prince. However, Camden had eluded death by escaping into the Shadowlands, and Mithras, with his godlike fortitude, managed to escape, fleeing in frenzy to Epping Forest, where he would bury himself in lupine territory. When Monty joined Alcoan, she had been conspiring with Camden about the whereabouts of Mithras. Being both experts of necromancy, they had a vast amount of common ground, and thus they joined forces to locate the torpored remains of the Prince of Avalon. However, despite fending off a few Garou attacks, when they finally dug Mithras from the ground, the final ambush would spell the final deaths of Alcoan and the majority of her pack. Monty was the last to escape, and whilst carrying Mithras over his shoulder, he exerted vast amounts of vitae and made the mistake of feasting upon the blood of the Methuselah. Compelled to drain more and more, he diablerized the former prince, and thus Mithras's soul became intertwined with Monty's. Mithras in these events struggles with Monty to control the body of which they both occupy, Dr. Camden concocted a plan to conduct a ritual to restore Mithras to his full strength, but much of this is subject to various forces, and whether if the Inquisition destroy Monty Coven first. In V20, Monty Coven has effectively lost control to Mithras. His ancient spirit now speaks with his voice, and enacts his will through Coven's body. Monty is, for better or for worse, perfected by the spirit of Mithras. Coven had all the potential of being a powerful Cainite, but lacked the pinpoint focus of an exceptional vampire. Mithras, on the other hand, is as focused as he was when he wandered the world in ancient times. However, he is no longer held back by his age. Youth has emboldened Mithras, made him more energetic, more driven to achieve everything he could have ever wanted. With the power of a Methuselah and the enthusiasm of a neonate, Monty has set out on a path to conquer Britain once more. Founding his own tech firm, Syndexioi, he utilizes technology to undermine the Elder Ventru of Britain, through blackmail or other means of stripping them of their wealth and power. As he does this, he is slowly building an army of rejects from sects which otherwise would not have a place within modern Britain. Whichever way you look at it, Mithras, despite his demise, remains the dark heart of Britain, and will forevermore. His godly status transcends temporary idols or temples. He can be felt in every facet of British society. He is the chaos of war. He is the knife in your back. He is your greatest ally and your most terrifying of foes. Death cannot defeat him, for the god of the sun, his vampiric empire in the Isles, will never truly set. Thank you for watching. As most of you know, it has been a rough couple of months for me. After losing my job, I've had to quickly find employment to keep afloat. Writing and editing this video has taken its time because of that. I've really enjoyed making this, however, and it's allowed me to drop into some older books which I haven't read for a long while. So, if you enjoyed this video, leaving a like, sharing, or subscribing really does help out. Thank you for all of your support these last few months, and do let me know what you want to see next in the comments below. But as always, stay safe, and do not wander naively into the night.